things that happened in the fires was not surprisingly very much a focus on the human impact on infrastructure, on housing, on homes. But there's an area which wasn't maybe touched on as much, and that was the culturally important sites and the impact on those. So I was wondering if you could give us the insights that you learnt through looking at the fires and the impact on culturally important areas, also on species that may not have been threatened species, but really culturally important species, and how we actually look at that going forward so that we're protecting across all aspects of community, human, ecological, cultural aspects as we look at fires going forward.
So I might jump in there, and I think it's important to sort of take a step back from that question for a moment. And there's been a lot of research in the past, but also in the wake of these fires, showing that in past fire events, Indigenous people, both as First Nations traditional owners, but also more generally, have very frequently been excluded, not only from the conversations in decision making and action, but also in this sort of assessment and looking back on the impact of fire. For example, in previous fires, Indigenous people are not necessarily given the focus that they need to be given in terms of the impact of fires. And this goes across all sorts of impacts, including the human community vulnerability and strengths understanding. But in the context of these fires, of course, there was actually a huge response and discussion, a national discussion really, I think for the first time, on the need to think about reintroducing and renewing fire regimes that are led by traditional owners and First Nations people, and looking at cultural fire and cultural land management. So that really has been a huge feature of the sort of shifted landscape, I think, in decision making and thinking, community thinking about the fires. So that's a real positive. But like you say, there's also the other kind of question about how culturally important places, species, ecosystems, waterways and others were affected, and the extent to which those things, those places and species and others were prioritised or could be prioritised in the fire recovery response. And I think that's, that's really critically dependent on having Indigenous voices in the decision making, both during the emergency and in the preparedness phase and in the recovery phase. I think the other thing to say is that one of the things that is a really key message that comes through that research is that for First Nations people, the biodiversity and ecosystem and heritage impacts are human impacts. They are just as very much a part of what it is for them as communities, as people. Country is part of the being of communities. And so perhaps unlike many of us non-Indigenous people, even the questions that poses are very, very different. For First Nations people living on and caring for their own country, the idea of being able to just get up and move somewhere else that's less dangerous or less at risk is not the same question as it is for many of us. Many of us have connections to the places we've lived, but not in the same way. And so there are qualitative differences in the need to actually protect those places and in the need for all those ecosystems and all those parts of country to be valued and to be recognised as mattering in that way.
Yeah, and I just really encourage everyone to have a look at the NEST report that was led by Kathy Robertson and Ollie Costello and Stephen Garnett, which got Indigenous perspectives on, well, what were the impacts? Well, what happened and what needs to change, and then what are some of the barriers that need to be overcome for those things to happen. And so we talk about integrated decision making, but yeah, that has to include sort of cultural assets as well. And so there's a lot to be done in terms of how do we empower Indigenous people to, as Rachel said, to be involved in decision making at all levels. Some of the issues and the barriers that were really sort of stark in that report, I think, and then when we think about private land, you know, there was this big, you know, there was a lot of talk about, okay, well, yes, like, you know, we're doing this wrong, and we should be looking to sort of traditional owner burning and, you know, integrated sort of management as a way forward. But there are massive issues on private land. There are huge access issues that need to be overcome so that our Indigenous people can, you know, can lead and implement these sort of management practices.
Yeah, go, John.
Yeah,
and that is that these fires were a terrible event, but they may well have helped progress conciliation in Australia and a better recognition and respect for Indigenous land management. I think non-Indigenous Australians have had a hubris that we can understand and manage this country. And these fires have shown that that's not really the case, and that we do need help. We do need to recognise the expertise of Indigenous Australians. So I think this is almost a landmark event in the way that we look after our country and the way we respect country and the original owners of this country.
Yeah.
And look, I completely agree, and I think that's been, you know, a great discussion. Really encourage people to look at the report that Libby suggested. There is an amazing amount of learnings, and I just know from myself, as we've been introducing, you know, cultural burning into some of the landscapes within bush heritage that previously hadn't, how much we're learning about how to adjust the way we're managing the land, and really looking at a right way science approach, and the right way science term being borrowed from right way fire. And how we can actually intertwine those knowledge sets and really, you know, move forward with managing the land in probably quite a different way than what we might have thought of in the past.
Yeah, I think, and Heather, sorry, that is one of those big issues I think to be overcome, is that different perspectives and understandings of fire and how it's used in the landscape that need to be overcome. So yes, that's great.
Great. Thanks, Libby, and thanks, Rachel and John.